Drunk Cowboy paid $2 for an old trunk. Inside was a letter from a child he never knew. He had the sun hung low over Cedar Falls like a dying campfire, painting the dusty street in shades of amber and regret. Jack Murdoch walked with the careful steps of a man who had learned to hide his whiskey from the world but not from himself. His boots kicked up small clouds of dirt with each step, the sound hollow and lonely in the evening quiet. The poker game at Murphy's had been good to him today. His pockets held more money than they had seen in weeks, enough to drink himself senseless for another month, maybe 2. The thought should have brought him comfort, but comfort was a stranger to Jack Murdoch these days. Had been for 15 years, if he was being honest. He paused outside Murphy's general store, squinting at the collection of odds and ends that sat beside the wooden steps like forgotten prayers. Old barrels with bent hoops, a rocking chair missing one arm, a pile of books swollen with moisture and time. And there, pushed against the wall like something ashamed of itself, sat an old trunk. The leather was cracked and faded, the color of dried blood. Brass corners had turned green with age, and the lock hung loose like a broken promise. Jack stared at it for a long moment, feeling something stir in his chest that wasn't whiskey or anger or the usual emptiness that lived there. The store's door creaked open, and Murphy himself stepped out, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He was a round man with kind eyes that had seen too much of life's hardships to judge anyone too harshly. "Evening, Jack," Murphy said, his voice carrying the weight of a day's work. "Heard you had some luck at the tables today." Jack nodded, still staring at the trunk. "What's the story on this old thing?" Murphy followed his gaze and shrugged. "Belonged to the widow Hartley. Poor woman passed last week, and her nephew just wanted it gone. Can't say I blame him. Who wants reminders of the dead cluttering up their lives?" The words hit Jack like a cold wind. Reminders of the dead. He knew something about those. What's he asking for it? $2, Murphy said. "Hell, I'd take one just to see it gone. Taking up space I need for paying customers." Jack reached into his pocket and felt the weight of his winnings. $2 was nothing. He'd spend more than that on whiskey before the night was through. But something about the trunk called to him, whispered of secrets and stories that might be worth more than the bottle. $2, he said, pulling out the coins. They felt heavy in his palm, warm from his pocket and bright in the fading light. Murphy's eyebrows rose. "You sure about that, Jack? Trunk's probably full of nothing but moth-eaten dresses and old letters. Nothing a man like you would have much use for." Jack handed over the money. "Maybe not. But $2 won't buy me much peace anyway." Murphy pocketed the coins and helped Jack lift the trunk. It was heavier than it looked, solid wood beneath the cracked leather. They carried it across the street to the saloon, up the narrow stairs that groaned under their weight, and into Jack's small room above the bar. The room smelled of whiskey and regret, with a narrow bed pushed against one wall and a table that leaned to the left like a man trying to hear secrets. A single window looked out over the main street, its glass so dirty that the world outside appeared soft and dreamlike. Murphy left with a nod, and Jack found himself alone with his purchase. The trunk sat in the middle of the room like a coffin, dark and silent and full of possibilities he wasn't sure he wanted to explore. He opened the bottle of whiskey that lived on his table, poured himself 3 fingers, and drank it down like medicine. The fire in his throat was familiar, almost comforting. He poured another and sat on his bed, staring at the trunk. Minutes passed. The sounds of the saloon below drifted up through the floorboards. Laughter, the clink of glasses, the soft shuffle of cards. Life going on without him the way it had for 15 years. Jack set down his glass and knelt beside the trunk. The lock was old and loose, more for show than security. He worked at it with his fingers until it clicked open, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He lifted the lid slowly, like a man opening a door he wasn't sure he wanted to walk through. The smell hit him first, lavender and thyme, the ghost of a woman's perfume mixed with dust and sorrow. Inside, folded carefully, were dresses of faded blue and yellow. A woman's dresses, small and neat, the kind a schoolteacher might wear. Beneath them, wrapped in brown paper, were books. poetry and literature, their pages yellow with age. Jack's hands trembled as he lifted out the dresses. They were too small for the widow Hartley, who had been a large woman. These belonged to someone else, someone from long ago. At the bottom of the trunk, beneath newspapers dated 10 years past, his fingers found something that made his heart stop. An envelope, cream-colored and carefully sealed. On the front, in a child's careful handwriting, were 2 words that hit him like bullets. Papa. Jack stared at the letter for a long time, afraid to touch it, afraid to breathe. The room around him seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in like the sides of a grave. His hands shook as he picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of words he had never expected to see. He opened it with the care of a man defusing a bomb, unfolding the paper as if it might crumble to dust at his touch. The handwriting was neat and young, the letters formed with the concentration of a child trying to make something beautiful. "Dear Papa," it began. "My name is Sarah. I am 10 years old. Mama says you are my father, though I have never seen you. She has your picture on her dressing table, and sometimes I see her looking at it when she thinks I am not watching. She cries sometimes, but she tries not to let me see." Jack's vision blurred. The whiskey glass fell from his other hand, shattering on the wooden floor, but he barely heard it. The letter continued in that careful, hopeful handwriting. "I wonder if you think about me sometimes. I wonder if you know that I exist. Mama says you went away to fight in the war and never came back, but she says that does not mean you do not love us. I hope that is true. I hope that somewhere, you think about the little girl you have never met." The words swam before his eyes. Sarah. A daughter. His daughter. "I am learning to read very well now. Mama teaches me, and I help her with the younger children at the school. I can write my letters and do sums, and I know all the states and their capitals. I think you would be proud of me if you knew me." Jack's chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing his heart with iron hands. He looked at the date on the letter. 2 years old. Where was this girl now? Where was her mother? The letter ended simply, "I love you, Papa, even though I do not know you. I hope that someday I will. Your daughter, Sarah." Jack sat back on his heels, the letter clutched in his shaking hands. The room spun around him, and for the first time in 15 years, it wasn't from whiskey. The weight of what he held. Not just paper and ink, but a life, a child, a piece of himself he had never known existed, pressed down on him like stones. He thought of the woman these dresses had belonged to. Not the widow Hartley, but someone else. Someone who had kept this letter, who had treasured it enough to pack it away with her most precious things. Someone who had known about Sarah when he had not. The broken whiskey glass caught the lamplight, sending tiny rainbows across the floor like tears made of light. Jack stared at them, then at the letter in his hands, and felt something crack open inside his chest. Something that had been locked away for so long he had forgotten it was there. Outside his window, the sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, leaving Cedar Falls in darkness. But in Jack's small room, surrounded by the ghosts of other people's lives, a different kind of light was beginning to dawn. The lamp burned low as Jack read the letter again, his fingers tracing each word like a blind man learning to see. The night pressed against his window, but he barely noticed. Time had stopped the moment he opened that envelope, and now he existed in a space between heartbeats, between the man he was and the man he should have been. "Mama teaches me," Sarah had written. "She is the schoolteacher here in Millerville." The name hit him like a fist to the chest. Mary. It had to be Mary. Jack set the letter down with shaking hands and walked to his dresser. In the bottom drawer, beneath shirts that smelled of whiskey and regret, his fingers found what they were looking for. A small leather folder worn smooth from years of being touched and put away, touched and put away. He opened it slowly, and there she was, Mary Patterson, frozen in time by the photographer's art. Her dark hair was pulled back neat and proper, but Jack remembered how it looked when she let it down, falling like silk over her shoulders. Her eyes were serious in the photograph, but he remembered how they sparkled when she laughed, how they went soft when she looked at him like he was something precious. The photograph was 15 years old, taken just before he left for the war. She had given it to him the night before he rode away, pressing it into his hands along with promises that felt as solid as stone back then. "Come back to me, Jack Murdoch," she had whispered. "Come back and we'll have that life we talked about. The little house with the garden. The children playing in the yard. Children." They had talked about children often in those sweet days before the world went mad. Mary wanted 3, maybe 4. She had names picked out, Sarah for a girl after her grandmother. Jack had teased her about planning so far ahead, but secretly he loved it. Loved the way she painted their future with such careful, hopeful strokes. He had promised to come back. Had sworn it on everything he held sacred. But the war had taken more than just the years. It had taken the man who made those promises, leaving behind someone else entirely. Someone who woke up screaming, who saw blood in his coffee and heard gunshots in the wind. Someone who couldn't imagine holding anything gentle without breaking it. Jack looked at Mary's photograph and then at Sarah's letter, and the pieces fell together like stones into a grave. The dates lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. Sarah was 10 years old. The war had ended 11 years ago. Jack had stayed away for 1 year after that, drinking in saloons and gambling halls, telling himself he needed time to heal before he could go back to her. But time hadn't healed him. Time had only taught him how to live with the wounds. He read the letter again, searching for clues about Mary between Sarah's careful words. "Mama says you went away to fight in the war and never came back, but she says that does not mean you do not love us." Mary had told their daughter about him, had kept his memory alive even when he had buried it in whiskey and shame. The thought made his chest tight with something that might have been gratitude or might have been agony. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. "She cries sometimes when she looks at old photographs," Sarah had written. Jack closed his eyes and saw Mary as she must be now, older, marked by the years he had stolen from her. Did she still teach school? Did she still hum while she cooked breakfast? Did she still believe in the goodness of people? Or had his abandonment taught her that promises were just pretty lies dressed up for special occasions? The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jack found himself thinking of that last night before he left for war. They had walked by the river, making plans for when he returned. Mary had talked about the schoolhouse she wanted to build, how she would teach reading and writing to all the children in the valley, rich and poor alike. "Education is like planting seeds," she had said, her hand warm in his. "You might not see the harvest right away, but someday those seeds will grow into something beautiful." She had been planting seeds even then, Jack realized. Seeds of hope, of love, of the future they would build together. And he had abandoned the garden before he could see what grew. He walked to the cracked mirror that hung beside his washbasin and stared at the stranger looking back. The face was his, but harder now, carved by years of poor choices and empty bottles. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and lines mapped the territory around his eyes like the dry riverbeds of a drought-stricken land. This was what Mary would see if he walked back into her life. Not the young man who had made promises by the river, but this hollow-eyed ghost who had spent 15 years running from everything good he had ever touched. But Sarah didn't know that. In her letter, he was still the father she had never met, the man who might someday come home and make everything right. She wrote about her birthday party, about learning to braid her hair, about helping her mother grade papers at the school. Simple things, everyday things, but they painted a picture of a life he had missed entirely. "I wonder if you think about me sometimes," she had written. The truth was, he hadn't thought about her because he hadn't known she existed. But if he had known, would it have changed anything? Would the knowledge that a child carried his name and his blood have been enough to pull him back from the edge of the bottle? Jack picked up the whiskey bottle from his table and held it up to the lamplight. The amber liquid caught the flame and held it, beautiful and deadly. For 15 years, this had been his answer to everything. Pain, loneliness, guilt, the weight of memories he couldn't carry. It had been his morning prayer and his evening benediction, the only friend that never asked questions or expected better. But now, looking at it with Sarah's letter in his other hand, he saw it differently. not as salvation, but as the bars of a prison he had built around himself. Every drink had been another nail in the coffin of the man Mary had loved, another step away from the father Sarah deserved. He thought about the dresses in the trunk, small and neat and carefully preserved. Someone had loved those dresses enough to keep them, even after their owner was gone. Someone had thought they were worth saving. Maybe that someone had been Mary herself. Maybe she had kept pieces of their old life, hoping that someday the man who had abandoned her would find his way back. Or maybe it had been Sarah, collecting fragments of a mother's past like a detective trying to solve the mystery of who she was and where she came from. The letter mentioned Millerville, a town Jack knew by reputation if not by sight. It was 2 days' hard ride from Cedar Falls, maybe 3 if a man was walking. Close enough to reach if he had the courage to try. Far enough away that he could pretend it didn't exist if he chose to keep running. Outside his window, the night was giving way to the first gray hints of dawn. Somewhere in that growing light, in a town called Millerville, a little girl named Sarah was probably sleeping in her bed, dreaming dreams that might include a father she had never met. And somewhere nearby, Mary was probably lying awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering if the man she had once loved was even still alive. Jack set the whiskey bottle back on the table without drinking from it and walked to his window. The street below was empty except for a stray dog picking through garbage behind the general store. In a few hours, the town would wake up and go about its business. The same business it had conducted every day for years. The same business Jack had watched from this same window, day after day, like a man serving a sentence he had imposed on himself. But something had changed. The letter had changed everything, shifting the walls of his prison just enough to let in a crack of light. For the first time in 15 years, Jack Murdoch had somewhere to be, someone who needed him, a reason to step outside the small bitter world he had built around his guilt. The question wasn't whether he could find the courage to go to Millerville. It was whether he could find the courage to face what he would discover when he got there. By noon the next day, Jack had sold everything he owned except the clothes on his back and the letter in his pocket. His horse went to the livery stable for $23. His gun, the Colt that had kept him alive through the war and the wild years after, brought 15 from a young cowboy who looked at the worn grip with the reverence of a man holding history. The rest came piece by piece, his pocket watch, his good boots, even the brass buttons from his coat. Each sale felt like shedding skin, stripping away the armor he had built around himself until only the man beneath remained. By sunset, he had $62 in his pocket and nothing else in the world except Sarah's letter and a pair of walking boots that had seen better days. The road to Millerville stretched out before him like a prayer written in dust and stone. 2 days on horseback, the man at the livery had told him. Maybe 6 on foot, depending on the weather and how often he stopped to rest. Jack didn't plan to rest much. The first day was the hardest. His body, poisoned by years of whiskey, rebelled against the sudden change like a broken horse fighting the bit. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold his water bottle. Sweat poured off him even in the cool morning air, and his stomach churned with a sickness that had nothing to do with bad food. But every time he wanted to turn back, every time his legs threatened to give out beneath him, he would touch the letter in his pocket and feel Sarah's words through the worn paper. "I wonder if you think about me sometimes." The simple honesty of it gave him strength to take another step, then another, until the miles began to pass beneath his feet like rosary beads. On the second day, the shaking stopped. On the third, he could hold food down without his stomach fighting him. By the fourth day, Jack realized something remarkable was happening. He was becoming human again. It started with small things. The way morning light looked different when his eyes weren't clouded with drink. The taste of water from a clear stream. The simple pleasure of walking without stumbling, of thinking without the fog that had lived in his head for so long. On the 5th day, he came across a family with a broken wagon wheel beside the road. The father was an older man with calloused hands and worry lines carved deep around his eyes. His wife sat in the shade of the wagon, fanning herself with a torn piece of cloth, while 2 young children played in the dust nearby. The old Jack would have walked past without stopping. The man he was becoming couldn't do that. "Trouble?" Jack asked, approaching slowly with his hands visible. These were careful times, and a stranger on the road could mean danger as easily as help. The father straightened, measuring Jack with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to judge character quickly. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because his shoulders relaxed slightly. "We'll cracked clean through," the man said. "Name's Samuel Tucker. This is my wife, Ruth, and our young ones, Emma and David." Jack tipped his hat to the woman. "Jack Murdoch. I'm handy with wood. Mind if I take a look?" For the next 3 hours, Jack worked in the dust beside the wagon, using Samuel's tools to fashion a temporary repair that would get them to the next town. His hands remembered skills he had learned as a boy, before the war, before the drinking, before he had forgotten what it felt like to build something instead of tearing it down. "You got family in Millerville?" Samuel asked as they worked. Jack paused, his hands still on the wheel. "A daughter," he said, and the words felt strange in his mouth. True but strange. "I've never met her." Samuel didn't ask questions, and Jack was grateful for that. Some stories were too heavy to share with strangers, no matter how kind. When the repair was finished, Ruth Tucker insisted on sharing their evening meal with him. It was simple fare: beans and cornbread, coffee that tasted like home. But it was the first time in years Jack had eaten with a family, the first time he had sat around a fire that wasn't burning in a saloon or a gambling hall. The children, shy at first, began to warm to him as the evening wore on. Emma, who couldn't have been more than 6, showed him a doll made from corn husks and scraps of cloth. David, a year or 2 older, peppered him with questions about the road ahead, about what it was like to travel alone. "Aren't you scared?" David asked, his eyes wide in the firelight. Jack considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But being scared isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it means you're doing something important." Ruth Tucker smiled at that, and Jack caught something in her expression that reminded him of Mary, the way she looked when she was proud of him for saying something wise. When morning came, the Tuckers offered to take him part of the way in their wagon, but Jack declined. The walking was important somehow, each step a small act of penance, each mile a promise to the daughter he had never known. "You're a good man, Jack Murdoch," Samuel said as they parted ways. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Jack touched his hat in farewell and resumed his journey, carrying with him the warmth of their kindness like a flame cupped against the wind. On the 6th day, as the sun climbed toward noon, Jack crested a hill and saw Millerville spread out in the valley below. It was smaller than he had expected. A main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above them like a finger pointing toward heaven, houses scattered along dusty roads that branched off like the tributaries of a dry river. Somewhere down there was Sarah. Somewhere in that collection of buildings and dreams was the daughter he had never held, never seen, never known existed until a letter in an old trunk changed everything. Jack's legs felt weak as he walked down into town, but not from exhaustion. This was something else, something deeper, the weight of 15 years of choices that had led him to this moment, to this place, to this reckoning with the man he had been and the father he might yet become. The first person he asked directed him to the church, where Pastor Williams lived with his family. The second person, an older woman hanging laundry on a line, stopped what she was doing when he mentioned the name Sarah. "Poor child," she said, shaking her head. "Such a shame about Mary. That woman was a saint, teaching all our children, never asking for more than a roof over her head and food on the table. And now little Sarah." She trailed off, pressing her lips together as if she had said too much. "What about Sarah?" Jack asked, though part of him already knew, already felt the cold finger of dread touching his spine. The woman looked at him with eyes full of sympathy. "She's been poorly since her mama passed. Lung sickness. Pastor Williams and his wife are caring for her. But," she shrugged, the gesture saying what her words couldn't. Jack thanked her and walked toward the church on unsteady legs. The white building stood clean and simple against the blue sky, its bell tower casting a long shadow across the dusty ground. Beside it sat a modest house with a vegetable garden and a swing hanging from an old oak tree. He stood at the gate for a long time, afraid to open it, afraid of what he would find on the other side. After 6 days of walking, after stripping away everything he owned and everything he had been, Jack Murdoch had finally arrived at the place where his redemption waited. But redemption, he was learning, sometimes came wearing the mask of heartbreak. Jack stood at the white gate for what felt like hours, his hand resting on the worn wood but unable to push it open. The house beyond looked peaceful in the afternoon light, a simple home with lace curtains in the windows and flowers blooming in neat rows beside the front steps. It was the kind of place Mary would have chosen, he thought. Clean and proper and full of quiet grace. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Somewhere inside that house was Sarah, the daughter he had never seen, never held, never known existed until a letter changed everything. What did you say to a child whose entire life you had missed? How did you explain 15 years of absence, 15 years of choosing whiskey over responsibility, running over staying? The front door opened before he could find the courage to knock. She was small, smaller than he had imagined from her careful handwriting. 10 years old but looking younger, with thin arms and a face pale as winter morning. Her dark hair fell in braids past her shoulders, and when she looked at him with those familiar eyes, Mary's eyes, gentle and curious and full of light, Jack felt his knees go weak. "Are you my papa?" she asked, her voice soft as a prayer. Jack opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He could only nod, his throat tight with 15 years of unshed tears. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then smiled. A smile that could have lit up the darkest night, that could have melted the ice around his heart if there had been any left to melt. "I knew you would come," she said simply. "Mama said you would someday." A woman appeared behind Sarah, wiping her hands on a kitchen apron. She was middle-aged and kind-looking, with worry lines around her eyes and the careful way of moving that came from caring for the sick. "You must be Jack Murdoch," she said. "I'm Martha Williams. My husband is the pastor here. Sarah has been telling us about you for weeks now." Jack found his voice at last. "I came as soon as I got her letter." Martha Williams looked at him with the measuring gaze of a woman who had seen men make promises they couldn't keep. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her, because she stepped back and motioned him inside. "Sarah, honey, why don't you show your papa to the sitting room? I'll make some coffee." The house smelled of beeswax and bread, of medicine and the faint scent of lavender. Sarah took his hand with fingers that felt fragile as bird bones, and Jack was careful to hold her gently, afraid that too firm a grip might break something precious. They sat together on a worn sofa by the window, and Jack marveled at how right it felt, how natural, despite never having done this before. Sarah tucked her feet under her and studied him with the serious attention children give to important things. "You look like the picture Mama kept," she said. "Older but the same eyes. Sad eyes, Mama called them. She said the war made you sad." Jack swallowed hard. "Your mama was a wise woman. She told me stories about you, about how you used to catch fireflies for her in mason jars, and how you could make a deck of cards dance in your hands like magic." "She remembered that?" Sarah nodded. "She remembered everything. She said love doesn't forget, even when it hurts." Martha Williams returned with coffee and sat across from them, her presence gentle but watchful. When Sarah went to her room to rest, the walking and talking had tired her more than it should have. Martha spoke quietly to Jack. "The doctor says weeks, maybe days," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "Her lungs are too damaged. We're doing what we can to keep her comfortable, but—" Jack stared into his coffee cup, watching the steam rise like prayers he didn't know how to say. "What can I do?" "Be her father," Martha said simply, "for whatever time she has left." That evening, Jack moved his few possessions into the spare room that Martha offered. It was small and clean, with a window that looked out on the garden where Sarah liked to sit when the weather was good. For the first time in 15 years, Jack Murdoch had a home. The days that followed were the most precious of his life. He read to Sarah from books of poetry and fairy tales, his rough voice growing gentler with each story. He told her about her mother as a young woman, How Mary had laughed at his terrible jokes. How she had insisted on teaching him proper grammar even when he pretended not to care. Sarah wanted to know everything. What Mary's favorite song was. How she looked when she was happy. Whether she really could make the best apple pie in 3 counties, as she had claimed. She could, Jack assured her, remembering the taste of cinnamon and love. She put a little nutmeg in the crust, that was her secret. I wish I could have tasted it, Sarah said wistfully. Jack found himself wishing for 1,000 things he couldn't give her. More time. Better health. The chance to take her fishing, to teach her to ride a horse, to see her grow up and become the remarkable woman he knew she would have been. But he could give her what he had. Stories and presents and the steady comfort of knowing she was loved. He taught her card tricks with patient hands, showing her how to shuffle and deal, how to make the kings and queens dance between her fingers the way he had once done for Mary. Magic? Sarah whispered, clapping her hands when he made the ace of hearts appear from behind her ear. Not magic, Jack said. Just practice. And a little bit of believing in wonder. As autumn faded toward winter, Sarah grew weaker. She spent more time in bed, her breathing shallow and labored. But her spirit remained bright. And in the quiet hours they spent together, Jack discovered what he had been missing all these years. Not just fatherhood, but purpose. Not just love, but the chance to give it freely without reservation or fear. On the last evening, when the doctor had come and gone with his grim shake of the head, Sarah called Jack to her bedside. Her face was pale as moonlight, but her eyes still held that gentle fire he remembered from Mary. "Papa," she whispered, "I made something for you." She reached under her pillow and pulled out a small wooden horse, carved with careful, childish hands. It was simple and imperfect, but beautiful in the way that love makes all things beautiful. "So you won't forget me," she said, pressing it into his palm. "So you'll remember that I was here, that I was yours, even if just for a little while." Jack held the wooden horse against his heart and made a promise that came from somewhere deeper than words. "I'll never forget you, Sarah. Not for a single day as long as I live." She smiled then, peaceful and complete, and Jack knew that somehow, in these brief weeks, they had built something that death itself couldn't tear down. Love. Family. The kind of connection that reaches across time and makes even the shortest life feel infinite. Sarah closed her eyes as snow began to fall outside the window, and Jack sat beside her through the long, quiet night, holding her hand and whispering stories of the mother she had loved and the father who had finally come home. So that's the story for today. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. On a scale of 10 to 0, how would you rate this story? And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay happy and take care.